music historiography, fashionable scholarship and serendipity, which is really what explains a lot of things that happen of great importance. I wanted to talk about how we've ended up with our musical canon. And by that, of course, I mean these guys. You know, these are the ones, especially in my generation, that you had on your piano. You can't believe what they cost nowadays. They used to be like cheap, not anymore. And the three Bs, remember? Who are they? Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms, right? Which I always thought was weird because for all kinds of reasons, we pick one from each century, one from each period, with Beethoven, of course, being the most appealing because he was the least appealing, at least personally, and perhaps the most powerful. So when you get into the musical canon, the fact is we all grew up with some exposure, most of us, to so-called classical music. That term in itself we could talk about forever. But who's in the club? And that's where and why are they in the club? You could say that about everything we all do. Which battles? Why don't we know about Ludlow? You'd think we would know that before we would know some incident that happened 2,000 miles away, right? But we don't, and it was right under our noses. And now someone is bringing it to us. So the canon is obviously flexible, but in music, it pretty much got set. And I want to quickly say why. And not only your Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms, and of course you're going to get Mozart and Haydn in there. Surely they get there somewhere, and Handel, and those other guys get there, don't they? Is the question. And what's Chopin doing in there? This guy. You know, he's a Pole. Where's the rest of our East European? Remember, there was no wall. There was no Cold War. The most extraordinary thing I think you can do with looking at music in the past is look at the trade route, if you will, the time lags of how people like Liszt, how people like Handel in his own era to become an international superstar by his more modest standards than we would have today. How did people go? Where did they go? These are gigging musicians. They have to make a living. Even when they had royal patronage, they were sent to other courts. They had an active life. They went places. There are no borders. There was nothing for Liszt between Istanbul and considering going to New York. You know, it's just wherever the money was, people went. So how do we end up with Chopin being the guy that many of us first heard is the classical music that many of us may have even fallen in love with and led us to want to take piano lessons? He's not even in this club of these other guys, right? He's not part of that. Did somebody decide to let one Slav in? Perhaps that's what happened, right? Okay, well, this story is too big, obviously, as all of our stories. But in the handout, I'm suggesting to you some resources. These are the things that happened. And this follows so well with what Susan was speaking about today. This positivism where suddenly with training, with scientific approach, this is what happened in the 19th century. I'm not going to go back to the medieval period, obviously, in our time limits here. But there was an explosion of publications trying to get this, which is the Bach manuscript, and first of all, you got to value it to publish it. That's part of the equation. Into something like this, the Bach Gesamtausgabe, and please note that most of what's going to be on your handout will be German terms. It will be the Germans who will own this game, who will make the decisions. The Austrians, the Germans, the German speakers, even though the language of music is what? What country? Italian. Everybody knows that, right? Where does musica come from? It certainly doesn't come from Hamburg. Thank you. It comes from Italia. You know, it comes from the heart and passion of Italians. And yet it will be German scholarship that will decide, not even aware that they're doing it, the canon that we all inherited when we turn on our classical radio stations, if they still have those where you are. The second thing to consider is the role of musical biographies, and something that was spoken about, of course, with Susan so beautifully this morning, that one of the things to remember about music is that unlike art that is tangible and that we have and that increases or disappears in value, you know, there are very few things in music that sell for $60 million. And there are loads of things in art that do. You know, the value of music is something that cannot be marketed the same way as art. And you would expect to find, and many of you may be familiar with this very important 1551 publication of Vasari's Lives of the Artists. This is considered the first biography in the fine arts. And it's not just one little book. It's huge by those times, with about 50 people in there, most of whom were his friends. Leonardo, people like that make it in, and a host of people we've never heard of today who were the pop artists of those days. You have to go 200 years later for music, because again, music is ephemeral. One of the most important paintings of music showing Schubert's, the typical salon setting for a composer like Schubert, right? Where music was there. It's not hear. If I sing to you, you have music. If I don't, you don't. You know, we have music in our head. We can't hold it. We can't pocket it. I can't give it to you exactly. And so what do you do with it? And so it takes really literally 200 years longer before you have a biography that even remotely resembles Vasari, and it would be Handel. It's 1 year after his death in 1760 because he was an Italian, French, and English superstar. He was Mr. International. He was Christian Dior. He was the guy in 1760, a year after his death, even during the last part of his career. So very famous. And who comes next? 1802. You see what a big gap that is? Bach, Forkel's biography of Bach, which is, again, considered monumental. Yes, there's a little dribble here and a little drabble here, and nobody's even singing or playing Bach, and yet there is a biography of Bach that's considered important in what we will call the Bach Revival. Very quickly, keeping moving, we could go through when does someone get to Beethoven, when does somebody get to anybody. But it takes time because it's music, and it's not art, and it's not literature, and it doesn't seem that biography is going to be the mover and the shaker. The big thing that will be the mover and shaker in terms of developing our canon that we still have to this day is going to be number 3, publications number 1. Biography, some. 3, this whole 19th century fashion for revival of early music, which was a humongous hit. It had a whole lot of movers and shakers. Some of the more famous people are Carl Friedrich Zelter, who was the teacher of Mendelssohn, who he really put the first Bach, St. Matthew's Passion interest into Mendelssohn. He basically said to Mendelssohn, hey, Felix, you're talented. Let's get some of this stuff back in the Singakademie in Berlin. Let's start performing this music. Bach had not disappeared, but it had been sort of an inside thing where the well-tempered clavier was something I practiced on my clavichord, then my forte piano, and I hand-copied her, or my student, or my slave, or, my somebody hand-copied it, and I gave you a copy, and you were fascinated by Bach's fugues, and you gave him a copy, and it kind of had a life, and people knew about all the music, and in the church, the cantatas were still circulating within the Protestant world, but they certainly weren't out in the performance, and then these guys worked together. You end up in 1829 with the first performance of the Bach B minor Mass in Berlin in the Singakademie. I mean, you talk about a hot dog event, because it certainly was. You talk about people being floored. You talk about a score that was inaccurate. You talk about something that needed some serious editing, but who cared? People walked out of there going, holy mackerel. And from that point on, you have the Bach Revival unto this day, with all of the refinement that those guys would not recognize. Another big movement, if you get curious about this, is the Sicilian movement, which was a revival in the 19th century, second half, primarily French, of church music. Now, church music hadn't gone away. Chant was still there in the Catholic Church. And chorales of Bach and his many, many people who were more successful than Bach ever was were still there in the Protestant Church. And Italian polyphony, Palestrina, and everybody else in that club. But in terms of it being current and important and something we want to relish and we want to deal with and we want to get out to the public, no, until this marvelous movement that you can check out if it's interesting to you in sacred music, Sicilian movement. And suddenly, of course, what will happen? Publications, biographies, performances. Otherwise, music does not exist, all right? In terms of this type of music. Yes. Okay, moving on. Personalities have had a lot to do with giving us our canon, too. We could look at someone like Wanda Lodowska, one of the greatest women in music ever. Harpsichordist, initially pianist, who rediscovered the harpsichord, who basically took a harpsichord to Russia and played it for Tolstoy, dragging it through the snow. She's a little woman. When she got out, it literally covered up to her nose. But she got to Russia with her harpsichord to play Bach for Tolstoy. That's a heck of a trip to think about, right? And Wanda Lodowska was in the era of recordings, so we have her recordings. We have her take on Bach, and she was one of the many people putting a fashion in music together. Many other people we could look at. What did Toscanini care about? That's what everybody cared about. What about Stokowski? That's what everybody cared about. What about Kusevitsky? That's what people, he being a modernist and interested in modern music. So when we had the personality that drove music, and there wasn't this division with classical for the elites and everybody else doing whatever. These guys were stars. These guys would have been on People magazine covers in their day. They were the equivalent. So that which these stars, these personalities cared about in an era where you didn't need the internet to know what was going on, that is the repertoire that suddenly mattered. And we can extend this up to what happened with Bernstein, who basically is considered the guy that brought back the Mahler symphonies. Now, Mahler Mahler, horn players, they'll crawl across glass to play Mahler symphonies, right? But Mahler, before Beethoven, was, Mahler. What happened? It had to happen through the passions of a man like Bernstein. So personalities being a factor. And finally, 5, the transformative role of recording. Suddenly there was a tangible way beyond those scores. And I give you in this handout, by the way, wherever the thing is, way more than you would ever want to know. I'm sure you're going to memorize all of this. I can see everybody drilling one another. But seriously, I give you the terms for, just see if I'm going fast is fun. If you're on the back, these were the early attempts to take and make complete works that did not actually quite get past, sometimes 1 volume, sometimes 2 pieces, sometimes 6 volumes. Who knew? A lot of things that would have been in, say, a Handel complete edition weren't even by Handel. It's going to take a couple of generations for people to get in and figure out who actually wrote what. They borrowed from each other the way you borrow flour and eggs from your friend, if you still do that old practice. And it was considered a compliment. So all kinds of things editorially have to be sorted out. So then you look at actually editions. No need to give you all the details, but look who gets a complete edition, so-called complete edition. And there's the crowd with Chopin in there, you see? And the story of how that happened we can tell over lunch. But it had to do with someone actually making the decision of, here, you're carrying the groceries, could you carry my tennis shoes also? It was very much an anomaly to have this Slav, because his career was in Paris, but it wasn't that important a career. Yeah, the music's gorgeous. So was a lot of other people's music gorgeous. But Chopin got anointed. He got to wear the cap. He got in the club. And to this day, that is, why we don't think about it now. Of course it would be Chopin. No, definitely. There was no of course about it. It was very much a kind of a fluke, a serendipity. Grétry, huge name. We don't most know it today. There are other names that we could look at. But this tells you the stream of publications coming out of that period that Susan was talking about, where suddenly the scientific side of music was full of gas. The gas tank was overflowing. You had a powerful horsepower, and everybody's cranking out these editions, and they are bought by a subscription. People like you and I are buying them for our home libraries. It was a fashion. This thing about monuments is interesting on the front page, because then going along with what Susan was so wonderfully putting out early, the national schools began creating what we would call anthologies of their music, anthologies of their own countries, with one Slavic entry again. You see the Musica Antica Bohemica, looking at ancient Slavic chants, Gregorian chant and early polyphony in the Czech, in what we call today Czech, Polish, Romanian world. But again, it's going to be the musical garden. The titles are wonderful. The Brits and the Germans and the Austrians, they're on it. These things went into 60, 140 volumes. You go to a good music library and you will see them filling row after row. Do we need them today? No, we've got digital everything. But when they came out, they were revelatory, and they had so much to do with national musical identity. Now, last thing. Oh, I'm going to go. Okay, and then I'm done. Recordings, we know the good and the bad and the ugly, right? Suddenly, you don't have to pay do, mi, so, mi. You don't have to do squat to get music. What do you have to do? You turn a crank. And that sounds hard now. Now we push a button. Now we think to push a button. Probably now we say, Alexa, give me music to relax by between 1820. I mean, now, who knows where this is going? Drives me nuts, but it is what it is. It is forming the future. I just had someone telling me about the virus. Someone just texted me, my goddaughter, and she says, this is what Amazon is saying we should do. And I'm going, oh my goodness, but enough of that. The point is, you don't have to do anything but push a button. Once you can push a button, you can't do great books anymore. You can't go back and do what you do anymore. Pushing a button, I can put all the world's canon of music probably on a flash drive. So what? Does it mean I can hear anything? Does it mean that I know the melodies? Does it mean I know anything about the harmonies? Does it mean I know why something blew the musical world open, like Rite of Spring, or Beethoven's Third Symphony, or any of the other things? So what? Nobody was asking so what, because we could now have it and buy it and take it home with us. And so what really opens up, you can't see, that's a split. The ground is coming open. You end up with a split. You have the musical canon, particularly in light of the 1940s, 30s, late 20s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, avant-garde, atonality, 12-tone, the academic side, the ivory tower, taking over new music, new composition, and essentially running the audience out the door, right? I still have people when the work that I do in my own world. I work a lot with groups out of the, touring things with Smithsonian, and I have people say, "Oh, Schoenberg, new music." And I'm going, "Honey, that guy's been dead so long. You're talking 1910. You know, come on, it's 100 years ago. Let's talk about it." Don't want to even hear the name. Don't want to hear the name. You drove audiences away. The modernism drove audiences away. They didn't have to go far. You had the pop world. You had the American songbook. You had Broadway. You had Gershwin. You had this glorious tradition. We didn't need to be pummeled with European avant-garde if we had our own great stuff, and I can buy it no longer in sheet music only where I have to play it, but I can put it on a machine and spin something, and then I get cassettes, and then I get, I don't have to do anything. It's mine. This divide has been terrible for what we call classical music. It's been terrible for the economics of it. It has run generations away from the musical canon and shut them out, and one of the most sad and wonderful things, the end of it, is that the good news is that's changing. There is hope. Ladies and gentlemen, I work a lot with ensembles. I work a lot with groups. I live in North Carolina now, but I go to Dallas a lot and other places. The composing that's going on now, and the Dallas Winds, 85 to 90% of their repertoire is written in the last 20 to 25 years, much of it in the last 10 years, and they are piling them in. Sometimes we have 14 student bands coming in any one concert. And composers like Eric Whitacre, who has created a virtual choir with up to 1,000 different people singing the parts, and the technology putting together each of their voices, and he conducting them with solos possible. All this cool stuff, melody, harmony, beauty, excitement, taking the best of everything that the human soul needs in music and bringing it back. There is a movement afoot, and that divide that I just showed, I actually believe that divide is going to heal. It's going to take 50 years, but it's on its way, and I'm actually very optimistic, and that is enough to say.